Pleasure to be here today. Thanks for having me. I'm going to be speaking today about criminal governance in general, and I'm going to be drawing on this book project that Tom mentioned, Criminal Leviathans. It's now forthcoming at Cambridge. It's a study of criminal organizations in Brazil, El Salvador, and Medellin. But I'll also be drawing on some co-authored work from Medellin with UNU-WIDER colleagues Santiago Tobon and Chris Blattman, as well as some of my own co-authored work with some other with some others on sort of looking at criminal governance at a hemispheric level. So you'll see a little bit of mix of different pieces in this presentation. I thought I would start with just sort of grounding our understanding of what criminal governance is. It's a very common phenomenon in Latin America, maybe not so common in other parts of the world that other people might be familiar with. So this was a neighborhood that I visited in the northeast of Brazil, kind of far-flung city in the northeast, and had been a very violent favela that was kind of infamous for its violence until all the gangs in the neighborhood were taken over by this prison gang known as Al-Qaeda. That is a reference to Al-Qaeda, but they don't actually have any connection with Al-Qaeda or any kind of religious or extremist position. They just thought the name was cool, and they call themselves Al-Qaeda. And they dominate all the local gangs, and they impose these rules in the neighborhood, which I've translated there on the right. I was speaking with the president of the Residents Association, and the way he put it was that when this gang took over the neighborhood, things got better. That there had been a lot of violence, and the gang kind of put an end to the violence. They imposed rules, but they're good rules. And one of the rules I found particularly fascinating was that they made a strong, they had a strong rule that public health and education workers needed to feel safe in the neighborhood so that they could get in, do their job, and get out. And if anything bad happened to anyone from those agencies, the gang was going to make sure the perpetrator was punished. That tells you a little bit about the complex relationship between criminal governance and state governance. Looking to Medellin, we have some systematic data on this. Hold on a second, I forgot to start my clock. Okay. So in Medellin, you have in some ways similar structure where each neighborhood has these local gangs. They're often portrayed like this on the left as these kind of violent, young guys. But in fact, they look a little bit like this group on the right, where you can see UNU-WIDER affiliate Santiago Tobon having a nice, calm conversation with these guys. They're explaining to us all the work they do in the community. They built a pool. They built sort of recreational areas. They are engaged in criminal activities, but they also try to win over the loyalty of the local people in their neighborhoods. And so what we found, to our surprise, is that state governance provision, service provision, and gang governance provision, we thought was going to be sort of a zero-sum game, right? They would be negatively correlated. But what we found is that people often go to both, right? That they can go to both. It's not zero-sum. People use both state and gang services, and it depends a little bit on the kind of things that you're looking for. So here you see in the red how much people go to the state how much people go to the gang for certain things. And you can see that along the bottom are the things that people go more to the gang for than to the state, right? Often things that involve theft or recovering a debt. I'll just briefly summarize. We have a paper now out in Restat that looks at a natural experiment where we were able to get some exogenous variation in close sort of distance to state institutions, how close you were to because of a change in sort of administrative boundaries. So that gave us a little bit of a causal leverage. And the kind of takeaway from this was that in places that were made a little closer to the state by this administrative choice, this sort of exogenous shift, gangs actually governed more. Right? The gangs seem to be responding to state governance with additional governance, as if there was a kind of battle for the loyalty of residents. And in particular, I want to highlight that effect was strongest in those neighborhoods where retail drug markets were the strongest, and I'll circle back to that in a bit. Okay, but Medellin is maybe a special case, or how do we know how representative that is at a kind of a global scale? Well, I sort of so to sort of begin to answer this question, we don't have great data, but it happens that the 2020 Latin Barometer, which is a big public opinion survey that's done in 18 Latin American countries, included for the first time some questions that related to criminal governance. So my co-authors and I exploited this to try to generate hemispheric, or at least Latin America, regional estimates of the extent of criminal governance, and also to look at the correlates. And I will say that we had begun this project years before, before there was systematic data, trying to just go through qualitative sources, and we came up with this estimate of 27 million. And then once we brought in this national representative survey, it jumped to almost 100 million. So it shows that people actually experience this, and if you ask them, we'll tell you about it, but it is often unasked about, right? It's a subject that isn't getting enough attention and is often not asked and should be asked about more. Okay, so this is what the questions look like. Basically, you were asked, is there an organized crime or armed group or narco group in your neighborhood? And if so, do they do any of these things? And we took these two answers to represent criminal governance. There's a gang in my neighborhood that controls robbery or improves security or imposes order. And we took as distinct answers extortion, they extort people, and violence, right? So we had sort of three categories of things that gangs could be said to do in your neighborhood, right? And you were only asked this if you already indicated that there was the presence of a gang in your neighborhood. And you can also just say that there was nothing. The gangs weren't, I have presence of gangs, but they don't do any of these things. You could answer as many of these as you liked. So because these are representative at the national level, we were able to back out this estimate of 77 to 101 million. By country, it looks a little bit like this. So this is presence, right? And you were only asked about gang activity if you indicated presence, so the percentages on governance are always lower than the percentages on presence, right? Leading to a total estimate of 14% of the population of Latin America experiencing criminal governance. You'll notice, I'll comment briefly on some of these top cases, right? So Brazil, by far, the largest, by far the highest percentage. It's also the largest country, right? So that's driving a lot of this. So let's talk about that, right? Why might Brazil, is this a kind of a report, is this a kind of measurement error? Is this realistic? One thing, and that we argue in the paper, is that the survey question in Portuguese mentions factions, facções, which is a kind of it's a sort of a proper noun, or it's kind of a certain kind of organization that all Brazilians know about. And it's a little different than pandilhas. This would be closer to saying maras or some other kind of brand name of a certain kind of gang that would be very familiar to people in each country, whereas pandilhas is a somewhat more generic term. So it's quite like, and facções are not only very common in Brazil, every city has facções. These are these kind of prison-based organizations that have kind of subsumed little street gangs into larger structures. Not only are facções common, but they are associated with governance. That's 5 minutes left? Okay, great. I guess if it's 10 minutes. Okay, so these signs that I'm showing you here, these are all been placed by facções. They began in Rio de Janeiro with the Comando Vermelho, which has dominated the favelas of Rio de Janeiro since the 1980s. And has, I don't want to over-glorify it, there's a lot of violence in the favelas of Rio, but many favela residents will tell you that their neighborhoods are places where they can go to work in the morning and come home and no one will break into their house, no one will steal their bicycle, they can let their kids play in the street. Why? Because the gangs provide a lot of local security. They don't prevent gunfights, they don't prevent invasions by other groups, they certainly don't prevent shootouts with the police, but they do prevent local property crime and sexual violence and interpersonal violence. The PCC in São Paulo kind of copied the Comando Vermelho in the 90s, and for those of you who have kind of followed this story, the extension of the PCC from the prison system into the urban periphery has corresponded with and likely caused this massive drop in homicides, transforming São Paulo from murder capital to the safest or the least homicidal state capital city in Brazil. And since then, these factions have spread throughout Brazil. This is kind of what my book talks about, and they've replicated these kinds of governance structures throughout urban peripheries throughout Brazil. So nowadays, this is kind of what Brazil looks like. Here you can see these rules, respect the locals, it's prohibited to steal in the community. This one says don't use drugs in front of children, and you see the police blocking it out because they don't want that. I don't know why. They think they're the ones who should be telling people to not smoke drugs in front of the kids, not the drug traffickers. 28 of the top 30 cities in the Latin Barometer sample were in Brazil. So that's Brazil. You also see Costa Rica and Ecuador, which you might say, that's kind of crazy. That can't be higher than Colombia or El Salvador. And that's, there's some problem there. But I think it's interesting to note that both of these countries have seen huge upticks in homicide. Ecuador, of course, has been transformed into this kind of hot spot. So in some ways, this data from 2020 could be somewhat of a predictor of things, of the kind of the organization of gangs into larger structures. Okay, in my remaining time, so let's see, what can the data tell us about public service delivery? We're also able to do some correlational studies. And so we find 3 counterintuitive correlations. Compared to places with non-governing gangs, people living with governing gangs rate governance service more highly. And that's not, they also have, these are also, places with governing gangs also have higher objective measures of state presence. And although governing gangs are frequently tax residents, residents reporting governance are less likely to report extortion or violence. So this is again from that Latin barometer data. We see that places with presence of criminal gangs have lower confidence in governance, lower and higher rating of police corruption. But if we look at the subset of places where gangs are governing, we see the opposite correlation. They rate governance higher, and they also report higher income. And that's true even if we use objective measures of state presence. So criminal governance does not undermine state services, and it may facilitate or complement them. And this idea that organized crime flourishes where state is weak is not just untrue in some cases, but on average misleading. I'm going to skip over this part. Okay, so let's think about, as we step back and think about, why do gangs govern at all, and what do states get out of it? Some gangs govern in order to tax residents, and this kind of stationary banditry seems to give limited motives to provide order. But these drug retailing groups, they are not taxing residents for the most part, or they tax residents at very low rates. They seek residents' loyalty as protection from police patrols, and that gives them an incentive to not tax locals. And this gives traffickers strong incentives to provide good governance, including facilitating access for non-police state services. So illicit drug profits, in the cases I study, are channeled into governance over civilians, provision of order, dispute resolution services, property rights, and other public goods. They even contribute to non-police state service delivery. And this benefits the state, or so I claim. So residents live under this duopoly of violence. They remain citizens and enjoy some rights, but they're subject to the authority of non-state armed actors. And these duopolies have persisted over generations, in the case of Rio, for 40 years. How? It doesn't seem to me to be through military superiority. The state enters and goes in and out of these areas at will. Sometimes it has shown when it wants to, it can roll back criminal governance, as with the UPP pacification program in Rio. So in my view, the threat to criminal that criminal governance poses is that it is useful to states, that it solves the problem of order in urban peripheries, and those are central to larger processes of urbanization and economic development. And so improved service provision in the short run seems to help entrench criminal governance in the long run. Thank you.